Hello and welcome to our learning series on Agile Transformation, a learning series brought to you by Sternbridge Technology Consulting. I'm the host, Kenny Gibbons, and I'll be taking you through this learning course. Welcome to today's episode 5 of our learning series. Building upon the Agile fundamentals, we now want to focus on the Scrum methodology. The Scrum methodology is the most widely used methodology that I have seen in the industry. It is also the foundation for scaling Agile frameworks across an organization, like the SAFe methodology. I will break the Scrum methodology into a multi-part series so that we can cover all the Scrum topics, starting with the fundamentals and then going into even more details within the process. Today's episode will cover those Scrum fundamentals. As I mentioned, we'll then cover more advanced Scrum topics in the follow-up episodes. Before jumping into today's episode, I wanted to highlight what we covered in the last episode on Agile fundamentals. In that episode, we discussed the iterative approach to Agile and how each iteration is intended to build upon the previous iteration. We covered common Agile methodologies in addition to Scrum, like Kanban, extreme programming, and an example of a scaling methodology framework that we will deep dive in later parts of this series, SAFe. Lastly, we covered some of the common organizational challenges that I have seen when organizations deploy Agile approaches. As always, if you would like to understand more about the goals of the course and the topics we'll cover, watch our introduction episode, episode 1. So with that, let's get started with today's topic. Let's first focus on the core roles that usually make up a Scrum team. The 4 core roles that make up a Scrum team are the product owner, who's responsible for the software product and the value it brings back to the business, a Scrum Master who ensures that the team is effective and able to meet their commitments, and lastly, the engineering team, which for this example, I broke into developers and testers. As a note, sometimes these roles can be combined into one person who can do multiple of these roles, but for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to split them between a developer and a tester role. Generally, testers and developers have different skill sets and expertise, so for production-grade solutions, I've usually seen these as split roles, which is why we split them here. In practice, the Scrum team can be extended to include additional roles. Extending the Scrum team is usually done on a use case basis, based on the type of product that's getting built, the team size, solution complexity, and where the solution is in its lifecycle and organizational process. Some of these additional roles are business analysts, user experience experts, user research experts, designers, DevOps support, and compliance support, specifically in regulated industries. As I mentioned, these are some common additional examples, but there may be different roles depending on the organizational need and some of the use cases as mentioned above. One of the examples is the roles may be different for an application-facing team that's building an application either from new or making some enhancements, and an infrastructure team. The tasks and the team makeup may be fundamentally different, even if they are truly a Scrum team. Another example is that if a solution is early in the lifecycle process, a user experience designer may be needed if the designs need to be designed from scratch. We will cover each of the extended roles in depth during our advanced Scrum topic episode, which will be as part of the next episode. Let's break down each of the core Scrum roles. And let's start with the product owner. The product owner is responsible for the product features, which is its overall usability, and the product decisions. They drive the product feature strategy and prioritization, and their focus is on delivering value back to the customers or the company or the business in general. Their main responsibilities are to define, prioritize, and manage key product functionality. They define the product features, and this sometimes means ideating to bring an idea to life for the product. But it could also mean updates to the product functionality to make it a more streamlined workflow for users. They prioritize what features and functionalities should be worked on, generally with the support of users or other stakeholders. They also build partnership with the end users and customers to ensure the product can and does meet their needs. Some examples of product owner tasks are a product owner for building a new time and attendance application. They will be the ones who drive what functionality is needed within that solution. It could be something simpler, like a product owner for an analytics dashboard, where they would drive what visualizations are needed and how users interact with the dashboards and what they look and feel like. Or they could be a product owner for a very large solution or application, And inside that large solution application, because that application is so large, they may own a section of the workflow or the software area. And an example of this I would think of is within SAP. There's a lot of different modules. You may have a product owner for each module. The next core role is the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master's role is to ensure the team remains focused on their commitments and that the team operates effectively. This includes upholding Scrum and Agile practices while driving continuous improvement where it makes sense for the team. They also support in the estimation process and scope commitments for the team, generally within that sprint timeline. The responsibilities in the Scrum process for the Scrum Master are to drive Scrum ceremonies where it makes sense, things like driving the daily stand-up, or other activities as aligned with the team like backlog grooming or sprint planning. The Scrum Master also supports the team in coordinating and unblocking areas that they are currently blocked in, especially when other teams are involved. An example of this is when a dependency is needed to be delivered upon by another team. In this case, the Scrum Master would first understand when does the team need this dependency resolved, and then that Scrum Master would coordinate with the other team, generally the other team's Scrum Master, to understand when can that team meet that commitment. If that team cannot meet that commitment, the Scrum Master will go back to their team and have a conversation on how to replan and how to do that. If neither of those commitments can be made across both of those teams, in scaled Agile, there's an escalation process for determining what takes priority across the team backlog. We'll talk through more of that mechanism in a future episode when we go through the SAFe methodology or the scaled Agile framework. Some other tasks that the Scrum Master does is they manage sprint commitments and the team capacity to meet those commitments. In addition to making sure that the commitments are made, they will also support in building and measuring team metrics where applicable. Now, with that being said, in my experience, organizational leaders like to have Scrum measurements like burn down charts and team velocity. However, in practice, this can take away focus from ensuring the team is effective. It also drifts from one of the core principles of Agile that states working software should be the measurement of success. Some examples of the Scrum Master tasks are creating capacity plans ahead of sprint planning, following up with the infrastructure team to get infrastructure provision so the team can deploy their application, and making sure that the infrastructure team is on time with that provisioning. And as I mentioned before, running daily stand-ups, sprint retrospectives, or driving sprint planning. We'll talk a little bit more about those Scrum cadences once we get through the core roles. And now let's talk through the developer and tester roles as part of the engineering teams. The developer role is to build or configure the software functionality, as well as create the documentation as they build it, and testers ensure the software remains consistent and usable with minimal bugs or defects. Their responsibility within a Scrum team is to estimate the work, design, build, test, and as I mentioned before, document the functionality. During sprint planning or backlog grooming, they provide estimates for delivering and testing the functionality. And in a healthy team, they would also include additional ideas or challenges that may occur when building or testing to help assist with the planning process and the overall estimations towards those commitments. They will also develop and maintain the technical documentation for the software. This is generally according to the organization's software delivery lifecycle process or SDLC process based off the mandates that are needed to be met. Some examples of the tasks that they will do will be update a system configuration document based on a new feature, develop test scripts to test newly developed functionality within that sprint, estimate a login screen to be 5 story points. We'll talk more about the story points process and the estimation process in the Advanced Scrum Fundamentals episode that we'll have right after this, but those are just some examples that the developers and testers are responsible for within the Scrum process. Now let's get into the different Scrum ceremonies that take place within the Scrum process. The ceremonies that every Scrum team should follow are backlog grooming, sprint planning, the daily stand-ups, sprint demos, and the retrospectives. With that being said, based off of my industry practice, this is a good guideline, and these should be the minimum meetings that the team has. In some organizations, it might make sense to have additional meetings based off of the organizational processes or the complexity that is needed. The Scrum ceremony here in the guideline should serve as that reference, but it doesn't mean that they're end-all be-all for what works for a Scrum team. Backlog grooming. The backlog grooming ceremony is the Scrum ceremony that is used to define the upcoming work. This could be new feature functionality, enhancements, defects, or general team tasks. The goal of the meeting should be to focus on the highest priority items that are to be worked on next in the upcoming sprint. During the backlog grooming call, the product owner usually outlines the item, and the team then discusses to further refine. This is where the team should ask questions, provide any additional ideas, thoughts, or raise any concerns with the feature. It is intended to be an open discussion where the team can discuss and review the upcoming item with the goal to define it as much as possible ahead of the next sprint. If time permitting, it is also best practice to try to have the item estimated during the backlog grooming process. In general, the backlog grooming should be done with the entire Scrum team for 1 hour at least once a week. Sometimes backlog grooming may need to occur more than once a week, depending on how well defined the backlog is. So if the backlog is not well defined, it may need to take place twice a week, at least while the team is getting started. Sprint planning. Sprint planning is a team ceremony to align on the commitments and tasks needed to be completed in the next sprint. In Scrum, this usually means 2 weeks, but is not always. It could be 3 weeks or sometimes even a month, but the industry standard is generally 2 weeks. The sprint planning is what kicks off the sprint. During sprint planning, the team develops an achievable sprint plan based on the prioritized items, which should be groomed during the backlog grooming process, and the team also identifies dependencies and blockers for completing those items. This includes if other teams need to be involved or need to be depended upon to deliver their deliverables within that sprint. The team will also align on the development approach for the items that need to be developed. This is to ensure everyone is aligned on the best approach. During sprint plannings that I've taken part in, there's usually a technical discussion to make sure that the technical leads and the developers that will work on this are aligned in the approach that should be done. Sprint planning takes place at the start of every sprint, and it should involve the entire Scrum team. It's usually a pretty intense and full meeting, and it can be up to 2 hours or longer to get through all the items. My recommendation is to usually start with an hour and a half and go from there. But like I said, it can be very challenging sometimes to get through all sprint items in an hour and a half. So as the team matures and progresses through the process, they should use their best judgment for what is the most effective way to sprint plan. The last thing I want to talk about in the sprint planning process is a key enabling pillar that goes into this, and that is understanding team capacity. Team capacity is critical to come up with an accurate sprint plan. The goal of sprint planning is to create a plan that can be achieved within that sprint timeframe and not have anything roll over into the next sprint. In order to do that, you need to have a really strong understanding of what your team's capacity is to work on items within the sprint, and then also estimate things well. We'll talk a little bit more about the capacity planning process in the next episode on Advanced Scrum. However, I wanted to mention that because this is one of the most critical pieces of getting sprint planning right. The daily stand-up. This is a daily ceremony, as the name states, to connect on tasks for the day. This includes any blockers, risks, or dependencies in addition to those tasks. During the daily, each member gives a quick update. It usually consists of the format of, first, what's your update from yesterday? 2, what's today's plan? And 3, any blockers. The update is intended to be quick so that the team can align and work on their tasks for the day. If an item needs more conversation, that item may be discussed after the meeting or when the right personnel are available. The entire Scrum team should give an update during the daily, and the goal of the daily is to only be 15 minutes long. However, sometimes that time can vary depending on the team size, so I've seen them get up to 30 minutes, but a good goal is 15 minutes and then move forward with your day. The sprint demo. The sprint demo is intended to give a live review of the functionality and tasks completed during the sprint. The goal is to showcase the tasks via working software, if applicable. Teams can also provide a review of any other completed tasks done during the sprint, and that's usually best practice from what I've seen and done in the industry as well. In general, the sprint demo attendees should be the Scrum team, business stakeholders, and sometimes leadership. In my experience, sprint demos are intended to be a showcase following an agile principle that the working software is the measure of success. This is how this comes to life in the Scrum process. This should be a safe space, and ultimately it forces developers to merge code and ensure things are working together. It can be difficult to get functionality fully completed at the end of a sprint, so during sprint demos, there can be problems or challenges during the demo. My input here is that the development team and the Scrum team should not be at fault for some of this, and it needs to be, as I mentioned before, that safe space. The sprint demo space should be safe for all stakeholders. The more digitally mature the outside Scrum team members are, like the business stakeholders and leadership, the easier it is to be open about where the software is. In my experience, if the business or leadership are not understanding or confident in the Scrum process, teams end up doing an internal demo first and then an external demo to make sure the demo and use case look good back to the business and that leadership stakeholders. This can sometimes be counterproductive, as teams should be focusing on the right approach versus just stringing together software just for a demo. And that's kind of the risk here if you don't focus on doing the right things and just trying to make demos happen because Scrum says it should. It can be critical here to manage the expectations for the stakeholders during this sprint demo process and make them understand that this is a safe pace and this is a privilege to be part of this process. And sometimes not everything's going to be perfect because the software is still being developed. And lastly, the retrospective. The retrospective is a ceremony to identify what is working well and where improvements can be made for the team. The goal is to ensure that the team can continuously adapt and improve their processes and ways of working. In general, this ceremony is led by the Scrum Master and includes the Scrum team. However, it could be opened up to broader stakeholders in some scenarios. A retrospective generally takes place at the end of every sprint, ahead of sprint planning, and it usually lasts 30 minutes to 1 hour. It is a really important process in the Agile approach where continuous improvement and the Agile principle of looking back and seeing where things can be improved comes to fruition here. In general, the way that I've seen the sprint retrospective take place is usually at least 3 parts of conversation. First one is what worked well in the sprint. The second one is what didn't work well in the sprint and what should we stop doing. And the third one is what should we consider or try next to help improve our processes. Now let's look at how all these ceremonies come together with an Agile plan. As a note, this diagram shows 3-week sprints, but as we discussed, what I see in the industry, generally speaking, best practice is 2 weeks. Irrespective of how long that sprint is, it generally follows the same cadences and the same ceremonies. Each sprint starts with a sprint planning meeting and ends with a sprint demo and a retro meeting. A weekly backlog grooming meeting takes place to continually groom the backlog items ahead of the upcoming sprints. This is where you build that backlog. When a sprint concludes, the team does that retrospective to improve processes for the next sprint. The Scrum team will continually iterate in this manner until a software release candidate is ready, generally following a minimal viable product MVP approach. It's ultimately up to the team, the business stakeholders, and leadership to determine when is that software ready to provide value back to the users and the customers. And in my experience, this iteration process could take place and get something to production as quickly as within a month, so 2 sprints, or it could take multiple months, sometimes up to a year, which is not ideal, but that's kind of the variability that it can take place during this iterative approach. That concludes today's episode outlining the Scrum process. In the next episode, we'll continue talking through the Scrum process, but building upon everything here in this episode. And in this, we'll talk through the extended Scrum roles that we didn't cover, how the backlog is managed and prioritized ahead of the sprints, and we'll talk through sprint capacity planning, that crucial pillar that I was talking about as part of the sprint planning process. I'm Kenny Gibbons, and thanks for listening to our course on Agile Transformation. I hope you have a great day.